Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which sadly is still wrapped in a pandemic with surges underway in the United States and many parts of Europe. The human species is having a hard time figuring out a sustainable path forward, building forward instead of building back through this crisis. And we also have, of course, an infodemic along with the pandemic. That's part of which is about the information, misinformation, and distraction that's been built around this actual disease, SARS-CoV-2, and the pandemic. And there's a larger question that's really emerged in the last few years more than it did in the years I got online. Is the system essentially broken? I'm here now with a someone who I think, like me, still sees the upside potential of connectivity that we have, and there are ways to cut through the morass of polarization and distraction. Uh, Sreenivasan is he's been at this as long as I have, if not longer. Certainly, he's been longer focused on this digital universe than I have. I came to it, after decades of conventional reporting, and Sri has had positions that you'll hear, of course, taken him into this arena in ways that have really been effective and innovative. Sri, it's great to have you with me here.
I'm delighted to be on the show. I'm a big fan of the show, big fan of you, big fan of the Earth Institute. So these are multiple worlds colliding here.
Yeah, I know. And I don't know how you can fit in this given your daily regimen of the other things you do. But you're here, and it's great to see you. And I hope you're faring okay despite the craziness of this time, which is especially tumultuous right now. These days are amazing. I want to start with the counter thesis of, is it all broken? I have many friends, and I've talked to many people across Colombia and more widely who've just gotten out of social media. You have every day there's posts like this one about, even WhatsApp now, which we all saw as a way to connect that seemed a little bit off the grid. It seemed a little less hackable, and now maybe Facebook's ruining it too. And you have folks like Jaron Lanier, who wrote his book, 10 Reasons to Turn Everything Off. Screw this, get off the internet. Back in 2012, I was writing encouraging pieces like this when I saw that Africa was getting this amazing burst of connectivity and bandwidth through, at that time, it was the World Cup coming to South Africa that drove private investment that was making everything seem so connected and connectable. And then kaboom. So is it broken, or is it both? Or how do you address that question, that primal question? Should we be on here at all?
Well, big questions right off the bat here. So no softballs, at least Leslie Stahl warned Trump before she asked the tough questions. Here you're jumping right into it. But by the way, I'm torn. I don't know whether I want it to be November 4th right away, or do I want to live through these next 7-8 days, because we're not even sure anything will be known on the 4th, unless it's a landslide. It's going to be stretched out as much as possible by Trump and company. And you remember, even something that wasn't where we weren't expecting a long drawn out process as we did in 2000, we had ended up 36 days of pain and not knowing what was going to happen. So, I'm warning everyone to kind of get ready for a long drawn out winter process here. Back to your question about something more fun, about social media. I think I hear more and more folks really upset about everything that's happening in social, everything that's seems to have gone wrong, where you saw that many of the big platforms promised that they had learned their lessons from 2016 and things were going to be better in 2020, but set aside the elections and just talk about the platforms themselves. We're seeing many of my friends who were big believers in Facebook and some of these other platforms aren't on Facebook anymore. They've just taken some time off, whether it's for a few months or permanently. I think they may not even be sure. And what you said about WhatsApp, this is a platform that I find most Americans aren't big consumers of, but in other parts of the world, the WhatsApp is as important as Facebook, if not more important. And in countries like India, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, etc., we have seen the real pain that a platform where bad and misinformation and disinformation can be shared instantly to so many people, what damage it can do.
Yeah, I was really struck. I mean, several years ago when it was the first of those border conflicts in Kashmir, I think, where it really almost resulted in a war. This misinformation around issues. It's not just an American phenomenon. And now it really is super consequential. What we saw here too, some of the clashes, even a physical attack on someone, were generated by false information. So, and on the big scale, you've got COVID misinformation from the White House, essentially, that's paralyzed people in many places.
Well, that is a question I've been wanting to ask you, Andy. That whenever we have looked at the future in fiction or in movies, it's always how the internet's not part of it, right? The electricity, electric grid, and the internet's the first to go. I have yet to read or see a movie where we actually kind of have the food supply and we have people going to office in this, going to work in this fashion while there's a virus going on. What do you think people didn't understand about this kind of process? This was not even fathomable by our best fiction writers.
Well, some recent movies have gotten at it, but you're right. Going back through time, the disconnection, when you're disconnected, that feels like it hasn't been adequately described. But there was one of the Bruce Willis movies, for example, was directly on this point, where the young hacker, the terrorists recruited hackers to take down everything, and that film actually really did sort of capture what can happen if information systems are either offline or completely maliciously manipulated. I guess my hope is, as long as we have the basic infrastructure to connect and expand it as much as we can so the digital divide shrinks, it has so much more potential to sustain and expand wellness if it's used, but it's always with the big if. Just yesterday, I replayed Pete Seeger, the classic old folky musician, socialist folky. Late in life, in his 90s, I interviewed him and asked him with another guy, what gives you optimism? Just generally. It was like a total general softball question. And he paused for like a second and a half, and he goes, "Oh, the internet." This is Pete Seeger. And his vision was that a young woman in Ohio or something who had a question, she could connect with a woman in India, actually, he says, and they could find an answer together. And, that basic attribute of the system, if it's transparent, if it's basically freely accessible, can do wonders, I think. And even going back 1871, Darwin, in his less famous book, The Descent of Man, he had a passage about, he said, there's only an artificial barrier that prevents us from transcending our tribalism. It's basically to connect. He actually had this weird vision in his head of, if we got out of our little local bubble, that can create a truly, we are one species kind of awareness. So that feels like it's still there, but I've become pretty discouraged. I've seen the downside dominate the upside. I think people aren't aware of how much work it takes to get cut through, to get in there, and that's what I want to talk about now, is your habits and attributes that you see as keys to flipping the narrative toward betterment, toward so what is it that drives you every day, every evening, when you could be home chilling with your family, going online and building a global community? Let's start with that. What's that part of you that wakes up in the morning and is thinking about that, as opposed to just, what are we going to cook tonight and what should we watch on Netflix and when I'm not working?
No, thanks. I think part of it is that I have 17-year-old twins. who are in the middle are very busy these days, and my wife is working harder than she's ever had to work. So everyone's busy in a apartment with 4 Zoom calls going on all the time. So we're all retreated into our own local bubbles. I am here in a about 57 inches by 58 inches spot that I have in our bedroom, where I am relegated to the entire day. So I might as well try to talk to other people. This is my one chance to connect with other folks. So I do have a daily global show where we talk about various aspects of COVID-19 and trying to just understand what's been happening. And I am hopeful for the most part. I used to call myself a tech evangelist and a tech skeptic. And people say, how can you be both? And I said, you have to be both. If you are only an evangelist for all this technology, you're going to not see all the problems and the pitfalls. And if you see only this, if you're only skeptical, you won't see the charms and the opportunities that are there for so many people. And so that's how I keep soldiering on, even though we are faced with this barrage of just absolutely horrific information that's coming from our, the one of the things you learn when you study all of this is that the bad information is coming from inside the house. When we were talking about science fiction, very rarely did you see it, apart from the Manchurian Candidate, that the worst information was going to come from the president of the United States, who was going to send out every single day the worst possible information. And I compare this to an alien invasion. In not a single alien invasion movie, apart from V, which was a miniseries back in the 80s, were there this conflict, this kind of, was the president type person conflicted about whose side he was on. And here we are being attacked, and we can't trust our leaders. It is just absolutely horrific. So what do you expect everyday people who don't have time, who are so busy? How do they know what to trust? Do you trust the institutions you've been told and taught to trust your whole life? Instead, it suddenly comes out that they may be toxic and filled with incorrect information.
And does that, I mean, how are you a nonstop tracker of Twitter, or do you kind of do it in
well, one of the terms that you've heard is doom scrolling, right? Where you're just looking at it, just getting more and more upset as you're reading. I do spend a lot of time on Twitter, but you can adjust your diet and make sure that you use Twitter lists to get the kind of information you want. Like, that's one of the most underused part of Twitter is the Twitter list. Have 5, 10, 15, 20 people whose word you trust, whose information means something to you. You know that they'll share valuable comments or posts or articles, and then check that instead of just checking your regular home screen. One of the things that social media, allows you to do is to label and categorize the people that you follow. And if you become good at doing that with lists, you can really change what you're listening to. And so you don't have to listen to just the worst people who randomly show up in your feed. You can actually control that on Facebook and on Twitter. There are ways in which you can kind of try to fight back. Doesn't mean you'll always succeed, but at least you have a shot.
That's a good one. And do you compartmentalize it in your life? In other words, you wake up in the morning. I don't know of anyone who is active on Twitter who doesn't wake up in the morning and look at their thing. But do you do the same thing before you go to bed, or do you have sort of a biorhythm to this?
Yeah, well, I think this is one of the sad parts, right? Like, even if you have someone lying next to you, the first thing you touch and the last thing you touch is your phone. That's so pathetic, but that's how many of us are these days. And especially in this moment with the election so close, we're in the elections already, and we're just wanting to see what is new, what is different, what can give me hope, or what will give me a kickstart to jump out of bed and get active and do something. But I think anybody who's just completely checked out isn't paying enough attention to what's at stake at this moment. I'm not saying you should be like that all the time, but these few days and few weeks and months, I think there's too much at stake. An unprecedented mix of political news, health news, financial news, racial inequality being being put under a microscope, and racial justice. Today I'd seen like one really horrifying story about coronavirus and the new numbers. And then immediately after that, I read about the Virginia Military Institute, the head of it resigning because Black students had complained about the relentless racism. And I thought that was good that I knew I was able to not miss that story, because it gave me some hope in the middle of a pretty hopeless day.
And I want to ask you something, show something, because I think it's just something you and I think about a lot. Hold on. Let me just switch to share screen again. So at Columbia, when I started the Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability, the first thing I tried to test was who's out there. Columbia has tens of thousands of people, literally.
Sure.
It's bigger than I thought when you include all the professional schools. So I sent out a Hail Mary kind of a survey. One of the questions I asked was, are you engaged with the public in face-to-face ways around your work goals? Oh, actually, I have the same thing for social media, but they really have the same, they have the same breakdown, similar. And you have people who are experienced, enthusiastic, as you can see here for public face-to-face work, it was 27%. Enthusiast, and then hopeful but hesitant was one of my categories. Hopeful but hesitant.
Yeah.
And the same thing for social media. And what I'm trying to do, here we go, is to get those enthusiasts to convene with the hesitant but hopeful, in hope that there's some interplay. There's some way to foster a little bit more experimentation, a little bit less hesitation. For folks who are in that category, I know you do a lot of coaching and sort of training. You've done some really good videos for the Alta Center. What's your main prod to take someone who's hesitant but hopeful into the arena of enthusiastic?
Well, you have to show people the value for their specific kind of work, right? And it really depends on their bosses, their stakeholders in their centers, their education, the institution they're in within Columbia, all of that. And I've seen this before, both at Columbia, where I was a professor for 20 years, and then I was the chief digital officer of the Metropolitan Museum. And there it was surprising to me how many curators and others were not interested in social media at all, because there was nothing in it for them. There was no reward system for being active in social media or being part of, like, being a public intellectual around your art. Some people saw it, but others did not. And I'll never forget how a young curator said, there was one of the things we decided at the Met was that we were going to put, every curator was going to have a web page and a photo and contact information, something that universities did 25 years ago for every single person. You can find them. And they said, no, he was like horrified. He said, this is a terrible idea. People would contact us. And I said, Noam Chomsky, one of the busiest people in the world, is accessible. Doesn't mean he's going to return your phone calls, but he's listed in the MIT phone book for a reason, because that's part of your job, is to be engaged with the world when you're in the academia, in the academy. And we should think about museums the same way, that you're a world leading expert on this topic, and you should be somebody who speaks and is out there advocating for the things you care about. And he was just like, he said, but I have nothing to gain from that, because in the world of museums, you're typically writing for a much smaller group of scholars in other parts of the world. But what's fascinating, Andy, is that both, let's say you both get a PhD in art history, and one of you goes to Columbia and one of you goes to the Met. The one who goes to Columbia has to start teaching right away, has number of classes, has rate my professor, has to write grants and be out there and do all kinds of things. Whereas most art history experts who become museum curators get 3 to 7 years to do an exhibition and work on things, and they don't have to engage with the public the way professors do, even if it's students and their peers. It's just a fascinating thing. I'll just say one last point on this, is that I would say that when you look at the world of museums, there aren't that many famous museum experts to the outside world. There is Neil deGrasse Tyson, but he's on another planet. But everyone else is,
Right.
you know, the museum world is very insular when on particular issues such as protection of art, the history of Nazi looting, and so many other topics. The cultural aspects and their expertise could play a definitive role in helping the public understand some of these thorny issues.
There's some comments coming in, and Joanne McGarry, who's a regular here from out in the Redwood country, Northern California. Greetings from the Redwoods. I've never had a Twitter account. I won't do Instagram. I was an early adopter to Facebook, which has been a blessing and a curse. I have an old iPad mini and a Jitterbug flip phone. She's really interesting. Joanne, I want to get her on my show because she's done these street corner sessions with umbrellas where you sit with someone and have a difficult conversation. It's like an invitation to have a conversation across cultural gaps.
Do you sit under an umbrella?
Well, the umbrella is just a signal to come hither, I guess. Yeah. And I think that's the kind of thing I'm always looking for. Is examples or, you know, where something like that could transfer to the online space is another question. It seems that maybe that's worth asking you about, which is a lot of what happens online seems to be designed to fracture us, to divide us. People typing comments. Do you see prospect for softening those interfaces, which seems easier to do in a town green once you get past the initial placard you're holding than it is online, or am I missing something? Is it impossible?
These are age-old questions, you know, going back to the Usenet groups and things like that about how do we make connections. I just want to say to Joanna, I presume you are reading a lot more. You're reading books and poetry and able to you know, be more centered with yourself and your family. I congratulate you on this. I think those of us who aren't able to do anything close like what you're doing, I'm really you know, jealous of people who can be that way. And I wish you the very best. I'm glad you're here. You're finding the sources like Andy who you find that you can trust and you want to engage with, but you don't have to overdo it. So I think that's good. Back to Andy's question about what can we, you know, do to get more people talking across lines, across divisions. There are some initiatives to try that, but I think we are poisoned by what we've seen on television. Those efforts were all meant to just kind of have people yell at each other. And I'll never forget, if you haven't seen it, the Jon Stewart going on Crossfire. You can find this on YouTube. Crossfire was this TV show that had, you know, one Republican and one Democrat talking to each other with guests, though it often just devolved into people yelling at each other. And Jon Stewart went as a guest on the show when Paul Begala represented the Liberals, and of all people, Tucker Carlson, who would then go on to be responsible for a lot of the poisoning of the waters at Fox later, was working at CNN. And Jon Stewart says, please stop. What you're doing here is not helping, is not cutting across any divisions. It's in fact making it worse. Oh, there you go. You found it. And it's a fascinating video, and it's kind of quaint, because if you go back and think about, this was 2006, it's not that long ago, but that's how far we've come, where even Fox in the old days used to have a show like this called Hannity and Combs.
Right.
And Combs was the Democrat. And now they don't even pretend, right? So all their primetime lineup are just people lying to you. And I tweeted yesterday that history will judge Fox News poorly for its role in downplaying the pandemic, in playing up Trumpists and hurting millions of Americans. And that's what a major news channel has done. At the same time, one of the best, most brilliant tactics of these conservative news organizations, as well as the president, has been to say that we are oppressed by technology, by big tech. They don't give us space, they censor us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then just absolutely dominate all the Facebook engagement listings that you see online and things like that, and the way There you go. And the way Trump has, we call it working the refs, as you know, Andy, where you keep complaining, and then the refs, in this case, Facebook goes out and hires absolutely right-wing people to be in charge of these things. There was an amazing New Yorker article about 2 weeks ago that I recommend every single person read about Facebook and what it's trying to do to be a better organization. One of the things they've said is, please give us time. We will fix this. Yeah. And one of the points that's made in the article is, what if it isn't in Facebook's interest to fix any of this? This is not broken. This is how Facebook thrives. And they have no incentive to do it doing this. When I was a student at Columbia, one of my professors was the great Fred Friendly, who was played by George Clooney in the movie Good Night and Good Luck. And he used to say that television, regular broadcast entertainment television, makes so much money doing its worst, it has no incentive to do its best. And you can take that and apply it 10 times over to many of these social media platforms. Why should they fix the problem of everything from notification addiction to the most supercharged, worst elements of us coming out on these screens? Because that's what benefits them. So I urge everybody to read that article and to understand that a company that has hired something like 50,000 people to do security and fight misinformation, maybe the system is the problem. Just throwing all the security guards in the world at it is not the answer if the system itself is flawed.
Yeah, and that Tristan Harris, who I knew from a long, long time ago when I was early days on .earth, my blog, he had a little app that I was using at that time. And then he went to co-found the Center for Humane Technology. He's now in this film, The Social Dilemma, which has gotten mixed reviews, but tons of views. And I think it's actually a very powerful identification of that problem, that the system is essentially designed still to take us to the worst part of ourselves, which is something that Jaron Lanier conveyed effectively, that it's a down scroll. It's so easy to hack the downside of us, the fight or flight part of us, the reactive part of us, that needs a huge amount of work. And as you just explained, and as that article explains, and actually Chris Hughes, who's one of the Facebook founders, did a piece several years ago that said, this is broken. The question is then what? It's going to take years, as Facebook is saying. That will take a long time. And this is the what do we do in the meantime part. It's that's why I think the skills, your basic primers are useful. When I tweeted about this, I put in a link to that Alda Center video you did for scientists who want to communicate effectively. And maybe, I don't know if you want to just sort of tick down in your own head, maybe a few of the top 10 items that you did mention, setting up lists. I know you have some other basic tips for folks out there who are hesitant but hopeful, or maybe like not even just hesitant, but really bummed out but hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, people don't want to. I think at the core, I believe that we can be better than this, but we are fighting an uphill battle where there's so much, we're drowning in so much muck that it's very hard for us to, come out at all. And we need to do better ourselves. So some of the things that I will say, I'll also just take one side step here to just mention WhatsApp and what's happening in India. In particular, WhatsApp, I have seen poison my own family members. Wow. That people who were completely normal, progressive, folks who believed in India's promise of a secular democracy where minorities are protected, they're just so overwhelmed every single day with so much hate that you start to question everything you believe, because there isn't another side, right? So even if you just look at American news and you look at Fox or you look at your Facebook and you see how it's dominated by the right, the left doesn't have enough to fight that. And journalists rightly will play the game of whataboutism and both sidisms on everything, instead of calling things out exactly as they should, because that's what journalists are trained to do. That's what you were trained so well to do. That's what I was trained so well to do. And so it becomes a right versus left, and then the journalists who should be calling a lot of this stuff out are not. And what the president has shown as a playbook for dictators now for forever is the problem is if you only have one scandal. If you have 1,000 scandals, nobody will follow up. Or with Obama, where he had one or two or three things that were portrayed as scandals, and Trump has so many, or 25,000 lies that he's going to cross this week. If Trump had been caught, if Obama had been caught in one or two lies, that would have all we would have talked about for every single day of his administration. But now it just shows you that you can overwhelm and flood the zone and really show that journalists and others are have no chance at this. And what I was saying about my family and others in India is also something that I learned I made a mistake on, that I focused a lot on young people and news literacy, young people and accurate information, young people and disinformation, when it was also a bigger problem, maybe even among older people who were fed this and found it very easy to share and just keep forwarding on the incorrect information. So my own focus has been that we have to do a lot for young people, but we have to do even more for older people, in part because older people are the ones also who go and vote, who have the time to sit around on their phones if they're retired to participate in these things, and the poisoning of the well that I keep saying just makes it worse and worse. Sorry to get so political on you, Andy. I didn't know if you were...
No, I think this is critical. And again, around the infodemic, I did a couple of sessions here with folks from the World Health Organization who were trying to develop a field of infodemiology, meaning to take the same techniques we use to flatten the curve by the way, which flattening of the curve, what's interesting about the pandemic is it requires wide-scale community activity. Unlike, climate change is more challenging, the issue I've been focused on for 30 plus years, because it's not just the function of people turning off the lights. Many, many things have to change. But for the pandemic, as we've heard over and over and over again, masks and physical distancing and washing your hands. And those are ubiquitous practices that are either undertaken or not. What they were saying, and what a lot of experts have been starting to study, is that with social media, as you were saying, there are habits. If they're widely, you can have herd immunity, potentially, if you immunize people to sort of react to information more carefully, more critically. It's a huge if. It's like not even capital letters. It's the biggest font in the world. But that says to me too, there are pathways forward that aren't just, obviously I think if there's some way to mandate fundamental change in the way Facebook and Twitter, to some extent, others operate, that's if that could be mandated, the result of litigation or regulation. But there's stuff we can do too. And I think that's a big part of what you're trying to do, unless I'm missing something.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and we all need to do something. So a couple of other tips. One was the usage of lists on Facebook. You can do that as well. Facebook, you can also use the see first feature, where you can pick up to 30 people and individuals who you want to see first in your feed. So that way you can make sure that that content is the first thing you see when you log onto Facebook. You can also hit the unfollow on Facebook without unfriending somebody. So that it's not awkward at Thanksgiving or elsewhere. Hopefully you're not going to a big Thanksgiving indoor meal, but if somebody says, "Oh, why did you unfriend me?" you can just unfollow them. And here's the information on the see first. So little things like that to much bigger things. Making sure before you forward something, you do the work it takes to share, to check up on it, and using Snopes. Right. And other tools. I like what Twitter has done just recently. You may have seen that when you go to share something on your phone, it says, "Wait a minute, you didn't read the article. You just read the headline." It said headlines can be misleading. How wonderful is that? And say, "Do you really want to share this?" And then when you share it, asking you to quote tweet it rather than just retweet it, so that you give some perspective, so people understand what it is you're saying. I've been on a one-man mission or semi-one-man mission to fight this idea that retweets are not endorsements. There are lots of people who just retweet random things saying, well, I don't take any responsibility. I'm just sending it out there. FYI. Well, in the old days of Twitter, maybe some people felt that was okay. But today, when the president retweets a racist, nobody stops and thinks, oh, maybe he's just trying to add to our civil discourse. No, we're saying he's a racist. He's a white supremacist. He's a white nationalist. So same thing for you. Why just retweet something? Take a look and then tell us why you were retweeting. What is there? There's something interesting in the third paragraph. Is this a point that you have been discussing before? It's just like in your office. If someone just willy-nilly forwarded out email articles without any context about why they're sending it to the entire office, you would be mad because you'd say, okay, tell us, is this because we're going to be discussing it at this 3 p.m. meeting? Or is it because it's something that applies to our work? Do I need to read the whole thing? Can I read just 2 paragraphs? I remember at Columbia Journalism School, we used to assign The Power Broker, that amazing book by Robert Caro. And one of the things you realize is if you assign books that are really heavy and difficult for students to read, and then you don't actually, this was the summer assignment before they came to school, and then many professors would never open it up again or ask them anything about it. So students resented that and said, you made us read it, but you didn't ask us anything about it. You didn't do the follow-up. So then they said, are there specific things you want us to read? And so we did that with the book. There were say 4 to 10 sections that we were going to follow through because they applied directly to understanding New York City for journalism students and things like that. And that made a difference. The same way, if you're sharing something, tell us why you're sharing it. Otherwise, I consider it a direct endorsement or whatever the heck you're sending out.
That's a really important point, and I'm just tweeting it right now. Great point by Sri live now. Retweets are endorsements unless you characterize why you are sharing and those Twitter ID disclaimers.
Thank you.
I think that's a good one. So I'm trying to, this is going to live on after this hour. It'd be available to share, and maybe we should talk about video platforms. Like it was largely because of you that I chose StreamYard March 15th when I was thinking about being locked down after 9 years of blogging at the New York Times, which was mostly, typing, but I needed to be part of the conversation. And I liked StreamYard as I saw what you were doing with your Sunday show and your other work. And it feels still to me good because it's discoverable live. It's a dynamic live experience. Zoom, you got to register and do all these other things. But do you have your own recommendation for what the role of video is generally for people going forward? Not everyone wants to be a face, and then others are really dug in on podcasts. Audio podcasts is another flooded zone these days.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit. Let's break that down a little bit. So I've been reading the print Sunday New York Times out loud on Facebook Live for 5 years this week. And it's been an incredible experience. I did it first to learn about live video and how it works. And then I did it because we built a community of people around the world who care about the news enough, including people who hate the New York Times, but join to understand what's happening in the Times. And we have guests on a regular basis. This week, we had an obituary editor of the New York Times who created the overlooked edition section of the obituaries that Andy, that just so important. All these women and men and women of color who are ignored by the New York Times when they died. And many years later, they did these articles, including Ida B. Wells never got an obituary, though when she was married, that was covered in the New York Times, but when she died, it was not. So this is one of the vagaries of the New York Times editorial process. But I've been doing that for 5 years, taught me the value of video in the middle of everything else that is going on, and so many different ways in which you can understand information and take in information. But the good news about what you're doing and what I do every day, and I work now, I have a company doing virtual events, including we did a conference for doctors, 700 ENT surgeons. We did the world's largest gathering of teachers, 100,000 teachers together, understanding what is happening with the education sector. All of that, what I've learned is that you don't have to be constrained to one medium or one platform. Right now on StreamYard, you can be on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and on LinkedIn. You can get a nice, clean audio recording that you can download and make into a podcast. And that's what I think all of us should be doing who are trying to influence people, is not be stuck on one platform or one method of storytelling. We did a thing the other day where we did a kind of impromptu memorial to the great Jim Dwyer, who passed away, the New York Times columnist who cared a lot about social justice and other issues. And we had Dan Barry, another great New York Times columnist, come on to our regular show and just talk about Jim for about 20 minutes. And then we took that 20-minute audio and video and we put that out, and it got a huge audience because they didn't have to watch an hour and a half of something. They could just watch. If we'd done it 2-minute version or 3 or 5-minute version, it would have been even better, because the chopped up information can be received by people with different interests at different times, at different moments in their day. And that's what you are able to do with this platform. So I'm a big fan of StreamYard, but there are people who only believe in Zoom as the only way to connect. And I talked to the CTO of Zoom. They had 10 million customers in December and 300 million by March. And you can imagine what their lives were like. Obviously, they had the kind of hockey stick growth that everybody talks about, but what that really meant inside the company. And we've seen the arrival of Zoom bombing. And I was a guest, not the organizer, of a tribute to a journalist who was retiring. We had congressmen, we had ambassadors all lined up in this Zoom call. We're all talking, and then suddenly the worst hate-filled takeover of the entire screen that you can imagine. For 3 minutes, we were just stuck. And those are the things that tell you that you have to pay attention to the tools you use. Doesn't mean that there can't be hacks and problems on every platform, but you have to really look for what you're trying to do. And here, the way you're able to do the one shots and the way you're able to do these tickers and banners and show all that, and the logo, this is why I like StreamYard for what they're able to do.
Yeah, and one thing I like about it, which people should be more aware of, I think, on YouTube as well, is if you have a clip, if there's a particularly good moment in a stream, in a Periscope particularly, because it's on Twitter, you can bookmark that moment and share that on Twitter so that people are cued into the most rich point in it. And a lot of the views we have on this webcast come through that post hoc, post episode engagement with a particular idea, or on my Sunday shows, a particular song. There were a couple of amazing songs about where we are with the election that were performed yesterday, and I can throw those back up in the social mix, and they generate a new conversation as well. I do like that bookmarking part as well. And I was on an event, again, not of my doing, last week, that also was my first Zoom bomb experience, and I guess that shows you that this will always be an iterative cat and mouse, the best of us and the worst of us kind of a race that we're on. Does it feel? I would imagine you don't anticipate we'll ever be to a new quote unquote normal that is like a static approach to how we communicate, unless you feel this is really heading ultimately toward a more managed, sane experience.
Well, I'm one of those guys who likes to say this too shall pass, but I really believe that whether this will pass, whether we'll get back to a new normal, really depends on what happens in the next 8 days. Because this White House, having announced that they have basically quit trying to control the virus, that vaccines are going to save us, when you know as well as anybody who studied this that the vaccine is not a single magic bullet, that there are millions of people poisoned to the idea of vaccines, thanks to Trump, Jenny McCarthy, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and all kinds of other people who have made vaccines an issue. And there isn't going to be just one vaccine. Dr. Ashish Jha of the Brown School of Public Health says there might be 15 or 20 vaccines, and which ones we take and when we take it, all of that. So whether we get back to a normal will really depend on the leadership that this country, which has failed it so far, if they're able to step up in the next few weeks and months. Before the pandemic, last December, I was asked on one of these things, what are my predictions for 2020? And I said that this is the most important election not because of the pandemic. Obviously, I had no idea, but because of the the planetary point of no return. What happens? And you've been teaching us for years, Andy, with your writing, your single-minded focus on
Yeah.
on the planet and the environment, that we are in real trouble here. And if we re-elect an administration and a cultural mindset across this country that drilling is the answer, when the Arctic hasn't been so late in getting ice, or hasn't gotten ice this late in the Arctic Sea ever, right? There's the latest point, you'll know this better than me, in late October not to have ice is kind of stunning in the Arctic. Like, those are all going to be much bigger issues than coronavirus, unfortunately, as we're going to have planetary worldwide crises, and we're going to have the first climate refugees that America is going to have. Like, these are things that America has always felt. Our great exceptionalism means that the rules don't apply to us. And 9/11 was a wake-up call, and we kind of went back to our everyday actions all over the world as a result of just becoming complacent. I think we're really good at complacency.
Yeah.
The wake-up call we had with Pearl Harbor was another example of where everything happens over there. We won't get affected. And to say that we could have climate refugees in America, and the wildfires are just a warning that this could be here to stay. So again, I'm thinking I'm a lot more, this has been a lot more of a downer episode than many people would have expected.
Well, the funny thing is I started it by challenging you with some downer questions, but I'm feeling much more enthusiastic halfway through, or 3/4 of the way through. There are a couple of questions, there are a couple of comments that came in I want to highlight too. Stefan Kaplan first had a technical detail. He said, Sri may be stuck in the corner of his Manhattan apartment, but make note of the great lighting. Great lighting is everything for visuals. Great to be here listening, and etc. That's pretty cool. And
Stefan is a former photo editor at the New York Times of 20 years, so he knows.
I'm recognizing the name. I know him.
He has a great show, by the way, called the Spin It Social Hour, where he interviews photographers about social media. So that's on Saturday morning. So
but one of my
Spin It Social on social media. So at Spin It Social.
At Spin It Social. All right, Stefan, I'm going to be in touch with you about that. And I also loved Jim Estrin founding the Lens blog at the time, when they still believed in blogs, which I wish they still did. But that's another great innovation. Stefan also said, at this point, as the great journalist David Beard, now at Nat Geo newsletters, just the fact that Nat Geo has newsletters now, I was there when they were working on that, has always said about social media, if you don't like what you're seeing, then you can change it. You can control your feeds with reason. Follow positive and productive Twitter handles if you want positivity, for example. You can shape your social world. And I think you kind of indicated a couple of ways to do that too. So that's great to see.
And David Beard is at DaBeard on Twitter, DaBeard, and he's a wonderful follow, because you will see that he tries to put out positive information when within reason, and then also, obviously, most important thing is it be accurate. And National Geographic has been great on Instagram and other platforms, as you know, and so now he's bringing that game to newsletters as well.
And I got to share one other thing that gives me some hope on that issue you were just talking about with these larger questions, the larger turn in the road that we are at with climate and other fundamental aspects of the Anthropocene challenge. Twitter has become a laboratory for innovation with visual displays of information. There was 2 or 3 scientists who used Twitter as a platform, like a test bed for different ways to portray climate data. This is basically the warming stripes, the blue to red was the first step. Ed Hawkins in England tried this as a 150-year record of planetary temperature. And then Alex Radke, a German scientist, took it forward. He said, your stripes end right now, right? It's like 1850 to now, but what about what's coming? And so he incorporated modeled pathways of future warming, and he's testing different ways to show that there's more than one future ahead of us. And I'm going to have them on the show soon to talk about Twitter as a visual laboratory for folks like that. So I think there is hope there too, that climate communication doesn't have to stay stuck with the old mode of me telling you a story like this 1988 cover story, warning, Will Robinson. This is the old model, and I think iterative, exploratory uses of data and other things can make a difference too. So we're kind of getting into that final 10 minutes, and I'd like to kind of dig more back in on last tips. And I'd love to have you on more than once. These conversations are always iterative. I've had 5 or 6 on with futurists on what's it like to be a futurist now when everything the futurists are telling us got kind of blown up. And I have episodes on what do you do specifically about COVID-19 policy that can make a difference. And they're always iterative. The best ones are the ones where we're circled back. We're going to do that on Friday. So I'm hoping you can come back.
Sure, I'd love to. And I just want to make a point that one of the things that Trump is always going on about Fauci is that he was against masks at one point. And I remember that interview where he gave about masks very early in the pandemic. And he said that if you put on a mask and you don't know what you're doing, you're going to take your dirty hands and then futz with the mask.
Sure.
So he wasn't saying that masks are bad. He was just saying that we're not recommending without proper training. And also there was a shortage of masks, if you remember, at the beginning of it, that scientists make mistakes, that scientists learn more and adjust, and the information adjusts. That's what the world we need to understand and believe in and live in. And I'd like to ask you, do you think now that article you wrote in Discover magazine in 1988 about greenhouse gases and the ozone layer, all of that was a wake-up call, right? And the ozone layer, we don't hear about it anymore. But do you think where do you think we'd be if we had been calling it climate change instead of global warming as the term the term that was more popular if we had gone one direction instead of the other in the 70s and 80s and early 90s?
I've thought long and hard about that. And I think basically labels don't really do it. I think the more I've dug in on the climate problem, well, one thing, it's clearly 2 problems that get conflated in ways that create almost a useless label. Climate crisis, climate emergency. The Guardian now has a style book that says you have to call it those things. You can't call it climate change anymore. And to me, that's absurd because there's nothing you can do about a climate crisis. Think about the dimensions of it. And there's vulnerability, whether you're in India or in Indiana. No one wants to be vulnerable to the climate system. You want to have adequate water. You want to be able to grow your food. You want to be able to know your home is secure. Wildfire zones. There's a ton of things that can be done right now to help people who are living in zones of fundamental fire vulnerability. So reducing climate vulnerability is something everyone can do something about right now, like with social media, what you can do right now. The grand systemic challenge of taking carbon out of our energy system and out of the atmosphere, and you have to do both to get a stable climate, is epic. And that requires a lot of what's in Biden's plan and more R&D, more basic science. So the only way to look at that landscape that's productive is to stop talking about the climate crisis and to start talking about climate opportunities, local. And then what's a gap? What are the things we're not doing? If you see that at Columbia, this recent study that came out, a report, a recommendation for tripling our R&D budget for energy for the next 5 through 2025 to about $25 billion a year. And then there are ways to tell that story, why you need to do that, even though we thought, well, we got solar panels all around. There's a reason for that. So that's a story to tell. That's a question to ask. And that's a path to pursue that doesn't solve the climate crisis, doesn't do anything about vulnerability, which is mostly generated locally. So I'm all about like breaking it into the pieces and getting busy on those pieces, and take the piece that's your piece and, drive the general question. Leadership absolutely matters, or the lack of it. But when you think about where we go from here, it's really about finding your piece. And sometimes that's a communication piece, like those scientists on Twitter. They could just do their science, right? And just get their tenure track studies, but they're pushing out a little bit. And that's a trait I think is really important and valuable. So I went on a little bit.
You're absolutely right. And I love what you said about the Guardian's approach to this. I think very important. Just a very quick question. People are mad at Joe Biden for telling the truth about oil and its future. Do you think, in my mind, the fact that all the reaction was, oh, this is bad for him because the right will exploit it. What about the left? Where does he get the credit for saying that? All I've seen, every single headline, is how this is bad for him to have said the truth at the moment when he said it.
Boy, I wish I could be swift enough to immediately pull up a tweet I did when I saw that Josh Fox is the filmmaker who calls himself a left-wing radical. And he made the film Gasland, which was that very dramatic portrayal of fracking impacts, mainly in Pennsylvania and the Catskills, that became a hot, touchstone in the whole argument for banning fracking. And he's been pushing for Biden really hard in the recent weeks. And I saw Tom Friedman, the ultimate uber centrist presence in the journalism landscape, who was doing the same thing. So I tweeted, well, we're in an urgent situation where compromise is essential on the progressive or Democrat side when you see Tom Friedman and Josh Fox basically saying the same thing, vote for Biden. And that pointing out the confluence you can have where everyone recognizes the pivotal nature of the election. You'll always have people with particular goals that will feel unrecognized, whether it's rapid action to fix the racist structural problems around us, or the rapid action to decarbonize that feels like it requires turning off every fossil fuel company's business right away. And I think one of the hardest challenges we face right now, with or without social media, is to acknowledge that response diversity, the diversity of responses and people who care about an outcome in a tough landscape where it's not just one thing, banning X. You need response diversity. You need people saying yes nuclear, people saying no fracking. But it's the hardest thing is, how do you then build a landscape where people are not just yelling at each other, where they're still working toward their goals and understanding their differences. And actually next Monday on this session, it's going to focus on how to have a difficult conversation with Peter Coleman, he founded the laboratory at Columbia. It's the Difficult Conversations Lab. And that he studies that in intractable conflict. You can get cooperation without having agreement, meaning you don't resolve the big issues, but you do cooperate. And that, I feel, is a really important trait. I wanted to point one last thing before we close out. I want to go to your current home base, or one of your places that you hang your hat is at Stony Brook University. And one of their initiatives that I've appreciated for a very long time is news literacy, like teaching news literacy, which to me is information literacy, even more than just news literacy. And I know there's been a focus there recently on broadening that. And I guess my question is, how important is it to take the challenge, the opportunities you're describing, to the youngest among us too, like to build this into how we learn? We used to have to learn the multiplication tables.
Yeah.
Right. So that part of our brain doesn't have to exist anymore. So are the things we can
with this? I'm a big fan of the news literacy, the Center for News Literacy, which is down the hall when I'm back at Stony Brook. And they do amazing work. There's multiple efforts like this across the country, and I think they're really important. And I had said earlier that I'm focused on senior citizens and literacy, but certainly young people, starting right in middle school onwards, we need to be teaching folks how to understand what's real and what's not. And you can use things like games and entertainment and their news of celebrities they like. It doesn't have to be hard-hitting news to understand. What you're teaching them is a sense of what's right, what are the weaknesses to look for, what are the hallmarks of wrong information. Just as we teach stranger danger in real life, we need to be teaching that online.
Right. Well, it's been great to have you here. Everyone should go to youtube.com/Sreenet, SREENET, to get on your lists for your video output, and SREE.net for your website. I would love to have you back on here. And I just want to end with a little bit of a plug for some sessions that are coming up. I had this set. I just want to show it. I think this is the one. No, that's today's. Here we go. So on Wednesday, we're going to talk to people who made a remarkable film called Picture a Scientist, which is about women's struggles to overcome the unbelievable barriers and abuse that have impeded having an even landscape for half of the planet, the females among us. And those issues also relate to where we go with race as well. So come on, join us on Wednesday. On Friday, as I mentioned to Sri, we have more coming on the question about the virus and how do we navigate effectively around that. This is the Earth Institute Thriving Online version of our Sustain What webcast. And thank you for being here through this hour. Sri will be back for sure. And he's a really great guide to how to live online, that portion of our life that happens online, how to pursue that with impact and stay sane at the same time, which can be really one of the biggest challenges is how you do that. What he said earlier about the fact that we wake up and go to sleep reaching for our device instead of the person next to us too often is one of the most important things that was said today. Sustain What is a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's the one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment. It's what's allowing us to connect right now, but too often, divides and confuses and distracts us. This webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. As soon as we're done, share the link you've been watching on with friends in circles far and wide. Get in touch with ideas. See that little distracting scrolling info bar at the bottom of the screen to find out how to do that. Stay safe from a distance until it's possible to hug those around you again physically, and vote, 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 vote. Thank you. Thanks for being here today. And thanks to Sri. He had to go into yet another event, so he had to leave, but it was great